Shabbat Shalom. So someone started a rumor about me this week, and some people repeated it, and by the time it got back to me, it had morphed into a lie that was so ridiculous that no one would believe it. So let me set the record straight. I am not retiring from B'nai Torah to take on a foolish cause. The Miami Dolphins did, in fact, ask me to come interview this weekend, but I have standards. I'm a Jets fan. What do we do when people lie about us? Somebody told a lie about Israel this week, and it was a big one. Amnesty International issued a report calling Israel an apartheid state. On its face, it seems absurd. In Israel's courts, an Arab Israeli citizen is as likely to be the judge or the attorney as a defendant, and even serving on the Supreme Court. In an Israeli hospital, Arab and Jewish doctors and nurses work shoulder to shoulder, serving everyone who comes through the door of the hospital needing care. In Israeli universities, 26% of undergraduates are of Arab Israeli origin. And if Brian Flores decides to pull a Ted Lasso and start coaching the other kind of football in Israel, he'll be working closely with the captain of Israel's national soccer team, a Circassian Israeli, Bibras Natko. Now, Amnesty International is a respected organization, is an organization that for many years has stood for truth. How did they get off the rails saying that Israel is an apartheid state? Because, by the way, saying that Israel is an apartheid state means that no matter what, Israel as a country can never be legitimate. Saying what Amnesty International says that Israel has no right to exist. So sometimes when someone tells a lie, you just have to respond forcefully with the truth and show how ridiculous that statement is. So, for example, Amnesty said that the representation of Palestinian citizens of Israel has been restricted and undermined. Well, there are 14 out of 120 members of the Knesset who are Arab Israelis, and the linchpin that holds together Israel's coalition is Mansour Abbas, who is the deputy speaker of the Knesset and sits in the cabinet, and without his party, there would be no Israeli government. Amnesty International attacked Israel's right of return. And I would point out, they claim the right of return is racist, but there are many countries that have similar laws. Mexico, Ireland, Spain, Greece, Poland, Germany, Italy. There are many countries in the world that say, if you have a relationship with our ethnicity, then you have a special path in. In the years when the British Commonwealth broke down, 1946, 1947, 1948, a lot of people got moved around. So anyone who has studied the histories of India and Pakistan knows that millions of people were displaced as those two countries were created. And the way it works today is if you are someone who grew up in India and are of Indian ethnic origin, of Hindu origin, you have an easier path than if you are Muslim, and the converse is true in Pakistan. So why pick on Israel? Why would Amnesty International focus their energy in this direction? Well, ironically, this report was released at a well-attended press conference in Jerusalem. Pro tip, countries that are actually engaging in repression and genocide don't have Amnesty International offices or press conferences. The Moscow office of Amnesty International was padlocked in 2016, and China may be hosting the Olympics, but they do not have an Amnesty International presence in China, I can assure you. Forget about places like Iran or Yemen. It's kind of like the story of that guy who, man walks down the street and sees a guy searching under a streetlight for his keys. It's like, what are you doing? I'm looking for my keys. It's like, well, where did you lose them? I lost them in the park. Well, why are you looking over here? Well, because there's light over here. There are plenty of places that you can go online to see a full analysis and debunking of the Amnesty report. But I want to focus on a little bit of a broader question, which is the questions of truth and untruth and how we relate to them. So there's a teaching of the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the one who came before Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and he relates to a very simple word in our portion this morning. The word is karashim, beams. So what beams are known for, except for the beams under our kitchen, is being straight. And however, if you shift those letters a little bit, you get sheker, which is a lie in Hebrew. So the best lies are the ones which are just a little bit off from the truth. The best lies are the ones where you can kind of lean them up, because if you think about the tabernacle, these beams, these boards, were leaned up one against another, and that's how they stood. So it's true that Israel is not a perfect place. So being a Palestinian resident of the West Bank and Gaza can be miserable. I would not want to live in Gaza. I would not want to live in a place where the government hasn't had elections in years and diverts building supplies, concrete, and plumbing pipes to make missiles and to make terror tunnels. You know, 26 years ago, tomorrow, Hamas operatives blew up a bus on Jaffa Road in Jerusalem, and two friends of mine, Matt and Sarah, were murdered in that attack. The man who planned that attack is still alive in an Israeli jail, and the Palestinian government in the West Bank is still giving a pension to his family. Some of you know I had an opportunity a few years ago to spend some time in the West Bank with Jews, with Arabs, and I've walked through the security checkpoints, and I can tell you it is not a fair situation for the people who walk through them. It is not a fair situation for the 18 and 19-year-old Israeli soldiers who put their lives on hold to make sure that nobody blows up another bus. I visited a refugee camp outside of Jerusalem, and anyone with a heart, outside of Bethlehem, anyone with a heart cannot be moved. But half a mile away from that camp is the luxury car dealership, where people buy cars with money that was meant for the people in that camp. And so I think as people with hearts, with people with sensitivity, we have to understand that there is real suffering, but we cannot be bamboozled into applying the blame where it does not belong. Israel is the only Jewish country in the world. There is one country in the world for Japanese. There is one country in the world for French. The Germans finally got it down to 1. The Koreans are still working on it. And I hope that someday the Palestinians have a country they can call their own, a country that lives in peace with Israel. Amnesty International is not bringing that day any closer by misrepresenting what is going on and by misassigning the blame that belongs with the failed leadership of those who are suffering. The issue that I actually have with this report, we have many people in our congregation who left South Africa in the 80s, in the 90s, and who actually knew what apartheid was. And one of them shared with me that using that word to describe Israel, forget about it being offensive to Israel, is actually disrespectful to the experience of those who actually lived apartheid in South Africa, who actually knew what it was to not have the right to vote, who actually knew what it was to not have the right to use the same trains and buses as everyone else. And so their reaction is in some ways like we have when someone compares something to the Holocaust, right? So someone says, well, vaccines are like the Holocaust. Or someone says banning a book. Well, actually, banning a book is a little bit like the Holocaust, particularly if it's about the Holocaust, by the way. So, you know, it's funny. There are lies. There are the people who make up the lies, and there are people who don't know any better who spread them. So as long as I'm on a roll here, the other big thing that happened this week was Whoopi Goldberg said that the Holocaust is not about race. It's about man's inhumanity to man. And Whoopi was wrong. So just like the last name Goldberg doesn't mean you're Jewish, the having light skin doesn't mean you are white either, because the Holocaust was precisely about racism. Now, we can argue over Kiddush whether her apology was sufficient or insufficient. I appreciate that she immediately realized that she had misspoken, and I took what I think were honest steps to make things right. But I think Whoopi fell victim to something that can happen to a lot of us, which is that we are so focused on the wrongs that our own community has experienced that we don't appreciate the challenges faced by others. That if all you are thinking about is racism against the African American community, you may not see the challenges that others face. And by the way, the same thing happens for us. Sometimes we get so focused on the real anti-Semitism and hatred and attacks against us, which have to be our first priority, that we don't realize, on the other hand, that we are not the only ones who have, if you will, tsuris. So lies happen. Sometimes someone tells a lie very intentionally, like amnesty. And others repeat it. And someone just doesn't get it. Sometimes someone is just misinformed. They hear something, they put two and two together, and they get 7. And so, to wrap up this package, in Hebrew, a sheker is a lie. And sometimes the antidote to a lie is a keresh, is a beam. Sometimes you just gotta whack someone over the head with the truth. Sometimes the answer is a different configuration of those letters. Kesher means a connection. So, this week I talked to some of the people who were misinformed, who heard something, took something out of context. And when you have a kesher, when you have a relationship, you can clear up a misunderstanding. If someone was not intending to lie, if someone was not intending to hurt, but someone just misheard or misassumed, it's possible to make things right. And so I don't know what will happen with Amnesty International. I know that there are responses that have already been offered and more to come. I worry because saying that Israel is an apartheid state opens a new door for delegitimization of Israel and for attacks for anyone who identifies with Israel. But on the other hand, I also understand that there are a lot of people who simply have been misinformed, who simply don't know. And so sometimes the answer to a sheker, to a lie, is a kerish, a beam. You got to hit it over the head with a 2x4. But sometimes the answer is a kesher. Sometimes the answer is we're going to sit down and talk about it. We are going to clarify because we have a relationship that can bring us to truth together. And so if someone has a misunderstanding about Israel, we have a chance to have a conversation about it, make it better. Someone has a misunderstanding about me, I'm happy to go to breakfast, maybe even at Goldberg's. Shabbat Shalom.